I'm trained in first aid. I haven't done it in a while, and I was helping a man who got shot in the leg with a rubber bullet. He was bleeding so much.
You saw this?
I was helping him. I was cutting his pants. I was trying to help him. I was trying to look at the wound, and they came up and they were shooting right at us.
Get his badge number! Get his badge number! He's on the underdog. Yo, hey! Hey!
Who were they aiming that at?
Now he's shooting at the photographer.
At us, like directly at us. Directly.
Why are they doing that?
He's shooting at our crew.
Continuing to fire at us. Okay, there we go. Here's a gas canister. All right, there has been no provocation, Joshua. There was nothing that happened whatsoever. The police pulled into this intersection unprovoked right into the middle of the crowd, split the crowd, started firing in both directions. They now have fired at us. Does anybody hear it?
Am I hearing that right?
All right, guys, I got hit. Yeah, I got hit. Hold on. This is a part of things we didn't see clearly on the video because we weren't able to roll. We had backed up. We were trying to get out of it. We got blocked again by a new route of police and National Guard. We needed to get out, so we put our hands up and said that we were media, walked toward them. We were still several hundred feet from them. We yelled, "We're media." They responded, "We don't care," and they opened fire a second time.
Jesus Christ! Get going! Go! Where do I go? I'm with WCCO. That's a WCCO car. Where we just, okay. Joe, get over here. Joe, I'm just getting my producer. Run the rest. Get out, run the rest. okay. I'm not fighting.
Okay, well, you keep going and go where you gotta go, and that's fine with us.
Okay.
We got plenty of time here.
Are you okay?
I'm getting shot! I'm getting
Katie, are you okay?
rubber bullets, it's okay. It's those pepper bullets. It's those pepper bullets.
Who are they aiming that at?
Nice shooting at the photographer.
At us, like directly at us.
Why are they doing that?
He's shooting at our crew.
I don't know.
Do they not know that obviously they see the camera?
This is Molly Hennessy-Fisk with the LA Times, and I just wanted to get this on the record that I was just at the 5th Precinct with a group of media. There was at least a dozen of us there, TV, still photo, and print. We identified ourselves as press, and they fired tear gas canisters on us at point blank range. I got hit in the leg. I'll post a photo of that. We asked them, I was saying, where do we go? Where do we go? They did not tell us where to go. They didn't direct us. They just fired on us.
You're listening
to Radio Lab.
Radio Lab.
From
WNYC.
Hey, I'm Jad Abumrad. This is Radio Lab. Quick warning. This episode contains some strong language and graphic violence, so if you are listening with kids, you might want to sit this one out. But okay, with that out of the way, we'll start things off with
recording.
Producer B.A. Parker.
Oh, boy. All right.
Do you have a sense of where you want to start?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Okay.
It all began, I think, in June. The George Floyd protests were happening in full flux in New York.
And Parker says since she was a journalist and forbidden from protesting, she was just stuck in her apartment.
Feeling kind of helpless.
And just spending a lot of her time thinking.
Defund the police department.
And I wound up having this genuinely befuddling thought of just wait, what exactly is the police for?
You mean what is their job?
Yes. That was just something that I was really trying to figure out for myself.
Now, I have to confess, initially, I didn't see how that was even a question. I mean, there are a lot of things that need to be talked about when it comes to policing in America, but their job description didn't seem to be one of them. I mean, that felt pretty clear to me. Police are supposed to enforce the law, yes, but more than that.
Police are sworn to protect and serve.
They're supposed to protect us.
To protect and serve.
That's what they say, right? I mean, it's the thing you see written on the sides of their cars, protect and serve.
To protect and serve the people.
Now, do they always do that? No, but that's clearly their job.
Yeah, that's what you'd think. That's what I thought. But then, funnily enough, a friend sent me an animated video.
If you've ever been on the internet, I mean, you're here right now.
Of this guy.
My name is Joe Lozito.
Named Joe Lozito. And he's got a bald head, trim goatee. And in this video, he basically just tells this
insane,
wild story.
You're going to die. Whipped out an 8-inch knife.
Of this thing that happened to him. That took this question that I had of what do the police do? And just sort of blew it open.
Tell me more.
So I saw this video.
Okay.
And it was about what happened to him. And so I went and I searched for him and messaged him.
Okay.
Cool.
My name is Joe Lozito. And one day in 2011, my morning commute was interrupted by the tail end of a 28-hour-long stabbing spree. The reason that spree ended is because I stopped it. And I learned The stabber, Maxim Gelman, was already famous across the city. I didn't know any of that though, because I'd gotten up too early to catch the paper. So when an obviously high person staggered crazily into the train, I just kind of figured morning in New York, you know? That creepy guy, who I'd later learn was Gelman, started banging on the door of the engineer's compartment.
Let me in.
I was sitting right by the door. The only thing separating the engineer and myself was a wall. It turned out there were 2 cops on the other side of the door, lying in wait in case Gelman hopped on this train. I found out later they'd recognized him, but they didn't charge out to stop him. Instead, they asked him a polite question.
Who are you? I'm the police. You're not the police.
You'd expect 2 armed cops to, I don't know, maybe do something about a wanted fugitive spree killer that they were on the train specifically to arrest, but they stayed put. So Gelman walked up to me, whipped out an 8-inch knife and told me,
"You're going to die."
Then he stabbed me. Once I had him pinned and was, dying of blood loss, the cops decided it was safe enough to arrest Gelman. Next thing I remember is a cop tapping me on the shoulder. "You can get up now, we got him." I thought that was being charitable, but at the time I didn't exactly feel argumentative. There was no pain yet, just this warm feeling from the blood gushing out of me. It was like standing in the shower with warm water spraying the top of your head and flowing down the back of your neck. And again, when you'd expect the police to jump to my aid, they didn't. None of them even touched me. The only guy to render aid was another passenger, Alfred Douglas, aka Napkin Man, because he staunched my bleeding injuries with napkins. I think Napkin Man probably saved my life, but at this point I'd been stabbed roughly all the times a person can be stabbed while remaining conscious. And so I passed out. When I eventually came to in the hospital, it was kind of frustrating to realize that none of the early coverage mentioned me or Napkin Man. The police gave all the credit to the 2 officers who'd been in the subway train with me, only neither of them actually even left the booth until I disarmed Gelman. During the grand jury hearing, one of the cops testified, "I started to come out, I opened the door, but I thought Gelman had a gun, so I closed the door and stayed inside." I can see how in a stressful situation you might mistake a knife for a gun, but also that kind of makes it more infuriating. If you, Mr. Cop A. Policington, thinks this insane, drug-addled murderer has a gun, and he's sitting on a train bound for Times Square, don't you want to stop him at all costs? So yeah, I decided to sue the NYPD. The first case I brought got dropped, so I acted as my own lawyer for the second case and finally made it to a judge. The judge said,
"Mr. Lozito's version of the story sounds highly credible, and his version of events rings true."
But I still lost the case. Here's how that was justified in its original legalese.
No direct promises of protection were made to Mr. Lozito, nor were there direct actions taken to protect Mr. Lozito prior to the attack. Therefore, a special duty did not exist.
It turns out there was a major piece of legal precedent in my way. In 2005, the Supreme Court ruled on Castle Rock v. Gonzales. You should make a note of a few things. First, my insurance had me in and out of the hospital in 2 days. And the hospital didn't give me any AIDS or hepatitis tests after I'd been stabbed with a knife that had stabbed other people. Apparently that's not medically necessary. Second, if you ever get the chance to confront a dangerous armed madman, don't trust in the police having your back. Don't expect to get the credit, and hope like hell there's another Napkin Man waiting in the wings to help you.
So can you just tell me your name and where you're from?
Yeah, Joseph Lozito, but everyone calls me Joe. And I'm from Long Island, Merrick, New York, but originally from Queens.
Hey, Joe, is there something in the background?
Yeah, oh shit. I didn't mute my TV, hold on. Fuck, I forgot about that. Okay, how about that? Is that better?
Yeah, I can't hear it now.
All right.
So let's go back to February of 2011, sorry.
2011, yeah. So February of 2011, February 12th, started like a regular day.
6 a.m. Joe got up.
I'm a creature of habit.
Got dressed, got out the door, went over to a Wawa.
Got my coffee.
At the time, he was living in Philly.
Working in New York City. So, drove to New Jersey, got on the train, took a nap.
Woke up in Manhattan.
Penn Station.
Made his way downstairs.
Where the subways are.
Got down on the platform, waited a minute.
Got on the first train, which is the 3 train.
Got in the very first car, took a seat.
In the very first seat.
So Joe's basically like at the very front of the train. A few more people got in.
And if you've taken the subway before, you know the doors are open for 10 seconds or whatever.
But this morning, Joe says they were just sitting there with the doors open.
Next thing I know, 2 police officers get on the subway.
And they walked up to the very front of the car where there's this little door.
To the motorman's compartment.
It's where the driver is, and the two officers, they go in there.
Which I thought was weird, but whatever. It's New York. Who the hell knows? Finally, the doors close. We start moving. But we're crawling as if a single person was behind the entire subway and pushing it. It was that slow. Which again was a little weird, but it was only going to get weirder.
Because it was right then, Joe noticed that there was this man, maybe mid-20s, 6 feet tall.
He was a little dirty.
Standing a few feet away from Joe. And this guy went over to the door where the officers and the driver were.
He starts banging on the door.
Starts yelling.
Let me in.
One of the officers shouts back.
Who are you? He says, I'm the police.
The officer shouts back, no, you're not. We're the police.
And with that, the man walks back without incident.
But then Joe looks across the train and notices this other guy.
Scared to death, like he was going to shit his pants.
A passenger. This guy had clearly seen the first guy and he was alarmed. So he goes up to the same door, starts knocking on it.
But with a bit of subtlety as to not draw attention, waving the cops to come out.
And he keeps knocking on this door.
Looking over his shoulder.
Back at the first guy who is now standing like a foot away from Joe.
And I look up at him.
And he says to Joe, you're going to die. And then he reaches into his jacket, pulls out an 8-inch knife, and stabs Joe. Right in his face.
Oh my God.
Under my left eye.
And Joe said,
you don't have time to think about it.
He lunged at this guy's legs.
Ended up wrapping my arms around his waist. And while I was taking him down,
this guy was able to stab Joe once, twice, 3 times in his head.
But I was able to get him down.
Joe landed on him with all of his weight.
But even with that, he still had the knife in his hand. And now all of a sudden, he's flailing up with the knife.
And Joe's got his hands out.
Trying to catch his wrist.
And this guy slashes at Joe, hits his hand, slashes again, slices his arm. And then the third time, Joe grabs this guy's wrist, slams it to the ground.
And the knife came out.
According to Joe, it's then,
and only then,
that one of the police officers who was behind that little door rushes over, grabs the guy,
and says, you can get up now, we got him.
At this point,
I've lost a lot of blood.
Joe is laying there bleeding from his face and his back and his hands. The cops are wrestling the madman. Other passengers are fleeing. At one point, a man rushes up to Joe and starts pressing napkins to his wounds. And eventually, the train gets to the next station.
And the paramedics are waiting there.
And they rush into the train.
Lift me up off of the subway seat to put me on the stretcher. And as they lift me up, I pass out. And it's kind of like when you start nodding off while you're watching television, where you're nodding off, but you could still hear what's going on in the background.
And Joe heard one of the officers who was on the train with him
call me likely.
Likely? What does that mean?
He wasn't sure. Eventually, they get him to a hospital.
Bring me in this room. And now all of a sudden is when the pain kicks in. And it's the worst pain I've ever had. Like someone doused my head in gasoline and lit it on fire. Like pain you can't even imagine.
They get him on morphine.
Jacked me up pretty good.
He ends up with like 80 staples in his body.
Wow.
Fast forward a little bit more. My day gets a lot better. My family's there. All of a sudden, my wife and my kids get there.
And in the midst of all this, at some point, a police officer shows up in Joe's room, introduces himself.
And he holds up a mugshot of the guy. And he says, is this the guy that did this to you? And I said, yes. And he says, oh, you're a hero. He killed 4 people last night.
Turns out his name was Maxim Gelman, who, AKA, after the fact, is called like the Butcher of Brighton Beach.
Oh.
But what's pretty astonishing about this, and Joe didn't know this at the time, but the police had been searching for this guy for the past 24 hours. Like there was a citywide manhunt for him. And that morning Joe was attacked, the police had gotten a tip that Gelman was in the subway. And so they sent hundreds of officers down there looking for him.
Wait, so the police on the train knew?
Knew.
But they stayed behind the door?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Takedown. Maxim Gelman.
And a few days later,
I'm doing all these interviews.
Joe, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
He's got a black eye, gnarly scars all over his head.
Wow.
Oh boy.
And in all these interviews,
They're calling me a hero.
A hero tonight, Jeff.
And I'm saying, well, I'm not a hero.
He still doesn't believe he's a hero.
Because I'm just a regular guy.
You're a hero.
I don't think I'm a hero.
I know, I hear you. You're a humble guy. That's cool.
instead, Joe's like,
The police are the heroes. The police are heroes.
You know, like I said, I'm just grateful for all the police and the EMTs that were down there to save me, or else, like I said, I wouldn't be here right now.
Those are the heroes. I'm not a hero.
But then a few things happened. After the news media moves on, after the two police officers on the train are praised by the mayor and the chief of police, after Joe testifies at Gelman's grand jury and gets him indicted, one day, Joe is walking down the street and he notices he's being followed.
I turn around quickly and I'm like, can I help you?
And the man told Joe, listen, I was part of the grand jury and I've got to tell you something. When those police officers testified, one of them told us while you were there rolling around on the floor with Gelman,
he said, I started to come out, but I thought he had a gun, so I closed the door and stayed inside. After we heard that, we got furious. He goes, the whole group of us, we all looked at each other like, did he actually just admit to not coming out to do his job and leave the subway full of people with the spree killer? He said after that, he goes, I had to tell you. And I'm sitting here going, like, holy shit. They left a spree killer, a known spree killer, a spree killing fugitive on a subway with probably 20 people, 20, 25 people.
When Joe heard this, he thought back to this moment when he was in the hospital recovering. It was when his sister came by. She's a cop. And he told her that he heard one of the officers on the train say that he was likely.
I said, what does likely mean? And she goes, they called you likely? And I go, yeah. And she turned white. And I go, what? She goes, likely means likely to die.
We reached out to the police officers who were on the train through their precinct, but never heard back. But anyway, make a long story short, after meeting that guy on the street, after thinking back to what really happened that day,
that was when we decided to pursue legal action.
So Joe decides to sue the police department. The problem is he couldn't get a lawyer to actually take his case to trial. So he decides to represent himself.
Got this gigantic box of legal documents.
Started pouring through his case.
If I had time before work, I was doing this before work. If I had time after work, I was doing this after work.
And eventually, Joe gets his day in court, tells his whole story, and says the cops failed him, failed everybody on that train, and they should have to pay. And the judge says Mr. Lozito's version of the story sounds highly credible, and his version of events rings true.
Basically says, you're telling the truth. But then goes on to say, but based on blah, 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 I have to dismiss this case.
Wait, what's the blah, 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 blah? Why?
Well, here's what the judge said. No direct promises of protection were made to Mr. Lozito, nor were there direct actions taken to protect Mr. Lozito prior to the attack. Therefore, a special duty did not exist.
What? I'm confused. What does that mean?
Well, she basically says the cops had no duty to protect Joe in that situation.
What?
Yeah. This is where you get to my earlier question. What are the police for? Despite what you think, legally, it turns out protecting you is not their job.
Protecting me is not their job. How is that even possibly true? That's not true. Is that true? How is that true?
Well, it turns out it has to do with some legal precedents.
Castle Rock versus Gonzales, that was the big one.
And to tell that story, I'm actually going to bring in some help. I'll come back, but for now, here's producer Sarah Kari.
Yes, hi. Okay, so I talked to this woman, Kristian McDaniel-Miccio,
an attorney and a law professor
in upstate New York.
Mm-hmm.
So where were you, like, in life or in the world, I guess, when you first got to know Jessica Lenahan?
I was the professor of law at the University of Denver Stern College of Law, and I was teaching law classes, and one of them was a seminar on domestic violence.
And one day she comes across this one case.
And I was thunderstruck, completely shocked.
It was a domestic violence case from Castle Rock, Colorado.
So I'm reading this and I'm thinking, I need to get involved.
She asked around, ended up finding the number of the woman who was at the center of the case.
And I met her. We became friends.
The woman's name is Jessica Lenahan.
She lived in the town of Castle Rock. She had 3 little girls
who were 10, 9, and 7 years old,
who she adored.
And back then, this is June 1999, she was getting a divorce from her husband,
Simon Gonzales,
and had even taken out a restraining order against him
that protected her and the children. Both.
And in this restraining order, there was this condition
that he had to give notice if he wanted to see the children.
If he were to violate that order, the police would have to arrest him.
That's right. So
a few weeks after she'd taken this restraining order,
June 22nd, 1999, the kids were playing outside, from what she told me.
Jessica was in the house.
And you know how kids are. They don't talk, they scream.
Mm-hmm.
So they're screaming at each other and they're playing, and all of a sudden it's very quiet. She looks out the window, no kids. She knew immediately Simon had taken them.
Because he has this history of being abusive,
she was beyond anxious.
She calls the police.
Repeatedly. She calls the police.
At 5:50 p.m.
At 7:30 p.m.
8:30 p.m.
10:10 p.m.
And she even later that night.
She goes in person to the Castle Rock Police Station at 12:40 a.m. on June 23rd.
And the thing was, Jessica worked at the police station as a custodian.
And we're not talking about a police department the size of the Bronx or the New York City Police Department. We're talking about a relatively small environment. And people knew who she was. And people knew that Simon was violent.
Basically, the police told her,
oh, you know, he'll bring, wait, he'll bring the kids back. Don't worry, he'll bring the kids back.
Like, the kids are with their dad. It's not a big deal.
And she was beside herself. Who else was she going to call? What was she going to do?
The police basically ignored the restraining order. I called and met with the Castle Rock police 9 times over a 10-hour period.
This is testimony from Jessica herself a few years later.
I begged them to find my daughters, to bring them to safety, and arrest Simon. My cries for help fell on deaf ears. The police went to dinner, looked for a lost dog, and had 3 officers tending to a routine traffic stop.
And what happens is, finally at 3 a.m. that night,
Simon drove up to the Castle Rock Police Station.
Got out of his truck.
I think he had a Glock, and he just started firing at the precinct.
Oh, wow.
Why would anybody do that? Why would anybody do that? You know the reaction you're going to get.
Like he wanted a confrontation?
He wanted to die. He knew if he fired on that precinct, they were going to come out and they were going to start firing at him.
The police come outside, open fire on Simon. He dies at the scene. And once the shooting stops, the police approach Simon's truck and open the door.
And at that point, they saw 3 dead little girls.
Oh, Christ.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Basically, the understanding is that Simon has killed them before arriving.
Wow.
And when Jessica arrived at the police station, she was taken into an interrogation room.
And she was informed. She didn't get to see her children. They wouldn't let her see her children. She didn't get to see her children until they were laid out for the funeral.
Eventually, after all this, Jessica decided to sue the Castle Rock Police Department, as Joe Lozito would with the NYPD over a decade later. And the argument that her lawyers were making is that the police, by not enacting this restraining order, by not seeking to arrest this man and protect Jessica and her children, by failing to do those things, they violated Jessica's 14th Amendment right.
And the 14th, again, is?
The 14th Amendment is the state shall not deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law.
I turned to the United States courts to seek justice, to hold police accountable for illegally ignoring and demeaning me and my children in our time of need.
So she files a petition in the federal district court,
which got kicked up to the 10th Circuit Court.
And then it went up to the Supremes.
We'll hear argument now, number 04278. The town of Castle Rock versus Jessica Gonzales.
So in 2005, Jessica's case went before the Supreme Court.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court.
And very quickly in this case, the justices started asking these questions that were...
Mr. Reichel, how would you describe the property?
They're just very technical.
What is the property your client has been deprived of?
They're questions about property and if the restraining order is property.
That would be a property right if she had a private contract.
Or there was a lot of discussion about...
the word shall enforce.
What the word shall means.
Sometimes shall does mean shall. Fine.
But eventually,
but if you compare it to
Ruth Bader Ginsberg zeroes in on the big question that we've been asking about the police's job, which is like, if we have restraining orders,
don't the police have an obligation to enforce them?
To my knowledge, we've never held that the police have an actionable obligation to enforce them.
What does the restraining order do then?
I think it does two main things. First of all, it gives her rights against her husband, which are enforceable through contempt and are enforceable by asking the police to enforce them. And that is the interest that the restraining order gives her.
But only to ask the police, and the police are not obliged to respond.
That is correct. She has the ability to ask the police to enforce the order, but the police have discretion under our reading of the statute.
And then Justice John Paul Stevens just asks point blank.
Do the police have any duty at all, in your view?
The police... I don't believe that the police have any sort of actionable duty. I think that what the statute...
And what you start to hear is this argument that's come up again and again at the court, that if you look at the 14th Amendment or the U.S. Constitution as a whole, there's nothing in there that says the police have to protect you from other people. In fact, that's not what the Constitution is for.
The Constitution is a negative rights constitution, meaning our Constitution is keep your laws off my body.
The Constitution is there only to protect you from the state.
There's no affirmative duty on the part of the state to protect you.
So it protects you from the police, theoretically.
Right.
But it doesn't demand that the police protect you from your abusive spouse.
Right, exactly. Which is why in Jessica's case, when Justice Stevens asked...
Do the police have any duty at all, in your view?
The lawyer for the police was like...
The police...
No.
I don't believe that the police have...
They didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to do a damn thing.
The case is submitted.
And to be brutally frank, I knew we were going to lose. I knew it. But I didn't think we'd lose as badly as we did.
In a 7-2 decision, the Supreme Court decided that the Castle Rock police had no duty to enforce the restraining order against Jessica's ex-husband. The two dissenting judges were John Paul Stevens and Ruth Bader Ginsberg. We reached out to the Castle Rock Police Department to interview them about Jessica Gonzales' case, but they declined.
In 2005, the United States Supreme Court threw out my case. The court also sent a message to police officers all over the country that they can ignore their responsibilities to enforce restraining orders and that they can get away with it.
When she lost, it was as if her children had been murdered again.
I went from being victimized by Simon to being victimized by Colorado and Castle Rock.
It was as if she experienced it all over again.
I felt so deceived. I'd grown up thinking that my government was bound by the laws and that it was just and fair. But all of a sudden, when I needed you the most, turned your back on me and my family. Obviously, the years after my tragedy have been hell. It's really paralyzing. Sometimes the pain overwhelms me, and I have to step away from my own life just to cope.
They were 3 beautiful little girls who didn't deserve this. No child deserves this. No woman deserves this.
Our system is broken, and I have paid the price for its flaws.
Hi, I'm Jessica Lenahan. I'm the petitioner in the case of Jessica Gonzales versus the United States of America. My life's work is to educate Americans that protection from domestic violence is our human right. I was born and raised in Pueblo, Colorado. I'm Native American and Latina. I met Simon Gonzales when we were children. Through the years, we saw each other off and on and eventually got married in 1990. We had 3 daughters, Rebecca, Catherine, and Leslie Gonzales. Slowly but surely, just became very controlling in what I wore and who I spoke to, and it slowly crept in over the 10.5 years that we had a marriage.
And he started acting really erratic, and threats of wanting to kill himself and threatening his neighbors, I'm gonna die, you're gonna die, somebody's gonna die.
He actually tried to hang himself in the garage in front of my children at one time. When you're a victim, you try to portray this life like it's fine, like there's nothing wrong. But when my children were starting to become affected and become frightened of him, I just decided that we're just gonna tell the truth. And no matter how painful or shameful I felt at that time, that it was really necessary to do whatever I needed to do as a mother to protect my children. In 1999, I decided I needed a restraining order, that it just got so dangerous for the children. I went before the judge and explained what was going on within my home, and the judge realized that Simon was a danger to me and the children, and that he needed to not be a part of the home at all and needed to stay at least 100 yards from the household itself. On June 22nd, 1999, Simon violated the restraining order by kidnapping the girls from my front yard. I called the police, and dispatch was supposed to send a car out, and I waited hours before they came out, and I called again. I'd given the officers the restraining order when they arrived, and they decided that because Simon was their father, that the children would be fine and they didn't have to look for them. I shouldn't worry, because they were with their father. But all in all, they just, throughout the evening, didn't look for them at all. They were very dismissive of any requests I made and belittling to me for even asking them for help. They called me ridiculous at one point. I contacted the police 9 times altogether, twice in person, and 7 times over the telephone. At 3:20 in the morning, Simon pulled up in front of the police station after buying a gun and opened fire on the police. And they fired back. Simon died, shot him dead. And then they found the bodies of my 3 children shot to death in the cab of the truck. Eventually, it went to the highest court in the land, which was the Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court said that I had no constitutional right to police protection or enforcement of my restraining order. So if restraining orders are not enforced, then they're not worth the paper they're written on. I filed a case with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights because my human rights were violated by Castle Rock, Colorado for not enforcing a restraining order to protect my children and myself. And my human rights were also violated within the court system for not providing a remedy.
I deserve answers, and I deserve to know the truth. I want to know why the police ignored my calls for help. I've been asking these questions for 9 years. 9 long years. How long will it take for you to help me discover the truth? I know I cannot bring my children back from that night. The emptiness I feel when I remember my daughters and the great lives they might have lived. Nothing can bring them back. Nothing. What I can do, however, is to be a voice for the voiceless and women who are promised protection in America and then denied it in the moment they're in danger.
By deciding in my favor, the Inter-American Commission has recognized that the United States allows human rights violations to continue against women and children. These are the facts and the statistics in our country. 1.3 million women are physically assaulted in the United States by an intimate partner each year. Every day, approximately 3 women and 1 man are murdered in the United States by an intimate partner. Every year, 3.3 million children are exposed to violence against their mothers or their female caretakers. Every day, approximately 4 children die from violence in the home. There are preventative measures. I believe education starting from very young will prevent violence, domestic violence, violence against women. All in all, it's not up to the Commission to change the U.S. It's up to United States citizens to decide to change this world for themselves. They can give us all the tools, but we have got to be able to embrace and put them to use. Our society traditionally thought of domestic violence as something that happened behind closed doors and that it was nobody else's business. But it is our business, and it should be our government's business too. Our government can't turn a blind eye to this human rights violation. It's happening right under their noses. Our country has an obligation to stop domestic violence in its tracks.
I have to say, talking to other lawyers about this case.
Again, this is B.A. Parker.
First of all, all these lawyers talk about this case in really quiet, somber tones.
Like it's a dark day for them.
It's a really dark day, but it was also an I get it.
Huh, what do you mean?
They understand, like they don't agree with the policy, but they understand why the Supreme Court made that decision. Because they say if the Constitution says the police must protect you, well, suddenly that's going to incentivize the police to be a lot more heavy-handed. Then we'd have to arrest for jaywalking. We'd have to arrest for, an open container. Like we'd have to arrest for everything. And you would have essentially a police state.
Is what you mean that they see Jessica Gonzales as like in a utilitarian sense, she's the cost you pay to preserve our safety from over-policing?
Yes.
Yeah, now that I think about that, like, are you convinced by that argument that there is that slippery slope that they seem to be worried about?
I mean, this idea that we either get discretion, meaning police make all their own subjective decisions and how to enforce the law, hello, racial bias, or we get a world in which they have an obligation to enforce every law across the board, but you get a police state. I don't understand why those have to be the two choices. Like, that just seems bananas to me. Like, I feel like there is some medium, and I don't understand why the law can't figure that out.
Well, is there some kind of middle path that says the police can have discretion, but they do have to protect us in certain cases?
Well, sort of. There's literally this special path.
JAD Radio Lab, we are back with B.A. Parker and Sarah Qari, and we just heard two different stories from two different people where the police failed to protect either of them, and we learned that according to the Constitution, the police don't have to. They have no constitutional duty to either of them.
Right, and you were wondering if they're if there is some sort of middle path to the police having to protect us?
Yes.
Yeah, right. So in that Supreme Court case, Scalia, in his opinion, kind of hints at that. Like, he references these cases in the lower courts that talk about this idea of like a special relationship.
Hello.
Hi. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I don't know. When I first encountered this term special relationship, I was like, what the heck? What does that mean?
Yeah.
So I called this guy, John Goldberg.
Professor at Harvard Law School, and my main area of interest and expertise is tort law.
And so real quick, tort law is the universe of law that governs what happens when one person hurts another person. And in tort law,
we have a general rule which says people aren't obliged to help you. It's your problem. It's not theirs.
The classic example is like if you're walking down the street and
you see somebody in need of rescue and you could easily and safely rescue them, but you don't.
Legally, that's totally fine. You don't have to do anything for them.
What? That's horrible.
Right. Morally, you've probably done something horribly wrong, but legally, you're not subject to liability.
See, okay, here's where I find myself thinking all about the limitations of the law.
Yeah, totally.
But the idea here is we may think it's virtuous and heroic even for someone to step in and rescue another person from some danger. But do we really think that if they don't do that, they should be paying thousands or millions of dollars to the victim because they chose not to?
I don't know, man. I don't get it either.
But
there's an exception to that in the law.
What the courts have said is if there's the right kind of special relationship between the person who's at risk and the person who could rescue them, there might be a legal duty to protect or rescue.
If two people are in a special relationship, then one of them has to protect the other.
So a classic example would be if you are a hotel and you invite people to come and stay in your hotel, as all hotels do, you need, working locks on the door to make sure nobody breaks in the middle of the night. You have to have a well-lit parking lot or maybe even a security guard. And that's all premised on the idea that a hotel or a motel or an inn owes it to its guests by virtue of their relationship.
John says you'll also see this special relationship status in transit industries,
airlines, taxi cabs, things like that.
Or you'll see it in these relationships between like a guardian and another person.
Between prison and prisoner, parents and minor children. So surely police officer citizen has got to be the right kind of special relationship, right?
Yeah.
But along come the courts and say, nope, actually not.
However, the courts have said that there are times when the police do have a special relationship. Like if certain conditions are present, then maybe, yes, the police do have an obligation to protect you.
What are the boxes you need to check in order to have a, quote, special relationship with the police so that they can protect you?
Well, most states have a rule that's similar to the one that you're seeing in New York.
This is Alexandra Lahav,
professor of law at the University of Connecticut.
And she told me that in a lot of different places around the U.S., it comes down to the very same criteria that Joe Lozito was being held to.
All right, so the rule in New York, and
it's sort of like this 4-point test. The first of which is that there has to be direct contact between the person and the police.
So someone goes to the police and says, you gotta help me.
The second thing is the police then have to respond to you and say,
okay, we're on it.
So some kind of promise to this individual, I will protect you. And then
number 3,
you need knowledge on the part of the officers that not acting could lead to harm.
The police also have to be aware that if they don't do anything, that the person will suffer.
That seems like getting in the head of the police.
Yeah, how could you know that kind of thing?
That's now you're seeing why this test is so hard to meet.
Right.
And then you need, in addition...
The fourth thing is kind of the most mind-boggling, which is the person asking for protection.
They believe justifiably that the police will protect them.
They have to prove that they relied on the police's protection.
They acted differently, exactly. They changed their behavior because they were like, oh, phew, now I know I'm safe so I can go out, but I wouldn't have gone out otherwise.
The way the courts look at these 4 criteria is like all 4 of them have to be checked off.
Now we've got the right kind of special relationship.
And in Joe Lozito's case, he just didn't check those boxes.
Well, very, very, very few people do.
Wow. God, what a minefield.
So if you think about it, in order for Joe Lozito to have checked those boxes, he would have had to, 1, walk up to the police and say, police, I need your help. I'm about to get stabbed. And then 2, the police would have needed to say, yes, we will help you. Because 3, we know that to not help you would definitely result in harm to your face and your back and your hands. And then 4, Joe would have then had to say, great, I will now relax myself and act differently in the knowledge that you will help me.
That is insane. That's insane. And I guess it kind of brings me back to Parker's original question, which is, if protecting people on the streets is so damn hard to make legally binding because it's not their job, then what is their job?
Now you come to the fundamental problem.
So this is Professor Barry Friedman.
Law professor at New York University School of Law, and I'm the faculty director of the policing project there.
Is there anywhere in the country that has like really clear laws for what the local or state police is supposed to be doing or what they're not supposed to be doing?
No.
Really?
It is remarkable. I was interested in policing for years and years, and this is a light bulb that went off in my head finally, and then I started to see it everywhere that I looked. What you get is, you might get a drone statute in one state, and you'll get a statute about chokeholds in another state, and you'll get a statute about, license plate readers in another state, but it's all totally like pinprick. And what you will never, ever, ever find is a comprehensive code of police conduct. Doesn't exist.
That's so strange. And like not even in like, I don't know, state constitutions or something? Maybe that's a far cry.
You're listening to is making me so happy because, you're listening and the veil is coming off of your eyes. And and it happened to me, but no, this is a question that we oddly don't ask much about the police, but ask in most other areas of government. So if you think about it, there's whether it's the FDA or your local zoning board, we don't usually think of government getting to do things without some sort of formal permission, a statute or a constitutional authorization.
Wait, so we've just like collectively as a society being like, hey, you're a cop. And they're like, oh, okay. What does that mean? I don't know. Just do what you got to do. And they're like, oh, all right. And then that's it.
Now, this is Jad in the present. To be fair, we called up a bunch of active duty officers.
Hello? Hello?
From all over the country, from South Carolina.
Recruiter for the City of Charleston Police Department. Sworn police officer in the state of Connecticut.
From Illinois, Florida.
Police officer with the Lincoln Police Department in Nebraska.
And when we asked them, what do they think their job is, they said, well, to protect people.
Oh, certainly that's part of it. Intervening and protecting.
Again and again, they said, yeah.
Helping people is kind of cliche as that sounds.
Our job is to protect and serve.
We want to protect people's stuff. We want to protect people against burglaries.
Trying to protect women from abusers.
We have a natural duty to protect.
What most police officers want to be doing is standing between the general public and violence.
You want to do your best to help other people and keep them out of harm's way.
That's why we're doing this.
And in talking to them about where that idea actually comes from.
Sure. So when you talk about duties.
Where is it written down?
That kind of gets into the code of ethics for policing or mottos.
It's ethics guidelines. It is mottos like protect and serve. It's city charters that created police forces in those cities. Charters that say things like, protect the peace, maintain order, enforce the law.
You're correct in getting the sense.
And this is something that came up in Sarakari's conversation with Barry Friedman, that the actual mandates for what police are supposed to be doing are kind of internal to the police departments themselves.
And the problem is there's a lack of democratic control. We don't use the ordinary ways that we do everything else in government with regard to the police. We don't pass statutes. We don't pass regulations. We don't then, because we have those statutes, do sufficient auditing to make sure that they're being followed. And the reason it's hard to hold people responsible today is because we're missing clear rules on the front to tell them what we expect them to do.
And I guess in that void, it seems like what happens is it leaves the courts to kind of debate over what those rules are and how to draw lines, I guess.
Yes, and they're terrible at it. I mean, if you think about it, the Constitution is kind of a weird way to run anything in government. I mean, it's a framework for government, but all it is a framework, and then the framework gets filled in with statutes. We have environmental protection statutes and we have workplace safety statutes, but we don't have policing statutes, and so basically the courts are left to try to hold people accountable or not under the vaguest of terms. That's why it's hard to hold people accountable and why people get frustrated. And the odd thing is they keep doubling down on that by creating more mechanisms on the back end to try to hold people responsible and don't notice that the whole problem is the vacuum as you described it on the front end. I mean, you've puzzled through it, Sarah, in a very logical way, and everywhere you turn looking for logic, you find a twist, and that's problematic. And what bothers me about the moment we're in, I mean, there are many bothersome things about the moment we're in. But people are walking around very much with a bad apples view of the problem, when the truth of the matter is that the orchard just isn't regulated.
Well, let me ask you a bigger question. I'm going to ask this to Parker.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not legally the police's job to protect us, then whose job is it?
I don't know.
Oh, this sounds so sad.
It is. But there's this one part of the story I haven't told you yet that gives me a little hope. Like, if you think back to Joe Lozito, the guy who got stabbed in the subway, it wasn't just Joe, the cops, and the stabber on the train that day. This was rush hour. There were a bunch of other people on the train. And when the stabber lunged at Joe, they got out of the way. We're like, absolutely not. I want no parts of this. I'm going to the next car. Took a step back, just like the cops did. But there was one guy on the train who didn't step back. He took a step forward.
My name is Alfred Douglas, and I was originally born in Jamaica. I came here 26 years old, and I've been living in New York ever since.
What was it like to witness something like that, to see someone get attacked?
Miss, I could tell you that, I'm 58 years old. I've never seen somebody so viciously slashed before.
So Alfred was on the 3 train with Joe.
I was just standing there.
And as the train started moving...
this guy came from the back of the train. And once he walked in, my eyes was fixed on him because, he didn't look right. And, he went and sit beside this woman. The woman get up and then he moved and went sit, across from Joe.
And all of a sudden...
He just lunged forward, jump onto Joe, and then start attacking Joe. Joe is all covered in blood. All the passenger that was up the front, they start running to the back of the car. While the tussle was going on, the police that was in the motorman's cabin, he opened the door and looked out, and then they went back in and,
hid. Just hid in there as Joe was getting stabbed.
After Joe Lozito took him down, and they were on the ground, the police came out the motorman car and grabbed him. Maxim Gilman now fighting the cop. By that time, Joe couldn't see, His head was covered in blood, you understand me? So he was just crying for his wife, his kids, and whatever. So I said to myself, we got to help him. So I kneel in his stomach, and, try to get control of his hand because the officer have his gun in one hand, and, trying to control him with one hand. So, I see that he needed help. So I went there and I kneeled down on him. So after he cuffed him up now, the train come to a stop. And when I look at Joe, I've never seen a slash like that before. His neck, the back of his neck, it was just jumping, pumping, blood just pumping out of him. It seemed like eternity because, Joe, he thought he was going to bleed out. I thought he was going to bleed out too. So I asked, if anybody have a tissue or a napkin. But before I got a tissue and napkin, I was applying pressure to his neck.
Mm-hmm.
And then somebody came with a piece of napkin, and I used the napkin to apply the pressure. That's just me. I was raised by my grandmother. I was taught to help. When you see a need for help, I just did what I thought that was right at the time.
Had you heard that Joe sued the city?
No, I haven't heard anything about that. And how did that go?
The judge threw the case out, citing that the police has no special duty to protect him.
Yeah, and so the transit cop that walk the beat down there, then have no duty to protect the consumers.
Essentially, yeah.
Damn, that's news to me. Why do they have the police in New York then if they ain't got no duty to protect us?
That's what I'm trying to figure out.
We're paying our taxes. That's what I thought they were employed for. This is new to me. I didn't know the police doesn't have a duty to protect the citizens of a country or a state. I got to process this.
Yeah.
And they know something like this exists. If this is the case, they should free up the gun laws in New York. Everybody could have their protection. I was living all my life, all this time, thinking, the police are there to serve and to protect. You understand me? If they see something unlawful happening, it's their duty to, be the judge and the jury on the spot. I can't see how they could say that it wasn't their job to protect the citizens. I don't know. It's a strange world, man.
Mm-hmm.
I got to process this and I got to let my kids know. And whoever will listen to me, I got to let them know, about this because this is news to me.
Like, it takes two, like a badly wounded guy and a guy with some napkins to defeat a serial killer.
Yeah.
And I say this fully aware that if I were in a situation like that, I don't know if I would jump in.
Oh, yeah. Hell no.
Like, the kindest thing I've done on the subway was like in February, I saw a girl crying and I gave her a tissue. And now that the COVID's happened, I know that I won't do that anymore.
You just give her an empathetic frown face across the way.
I'm like, I'm sorry, ma'am.
I'm sorry. I'm going to leave this Kleenex right over here and you can come and get it.
Yep.
have notes. 2. I want to thank the organizers of this first, and I also want to register a complaint with them. When I asked, what would you like me to talk about, they said, talk about what keeps you up at night. What keeps me up at night usually is dinner. I thought that probably wouldn't be a good topic. So now I'm left with a topic actually that brings me to tears. I want to talk about Joshua DeShaney. Joshua DeShaney was born in 1979 to a very young couple, to a couple known as Melody and Randy DeShaney, who divorced within a year or 2 years of the marriage, having produced really only tons of tears, tons of fights, physical abuse, and the poor boy Joshua. They got a divorce shortly after Joshua was born. Melody tried to take care of Joshua, decided that she really wasn't mature enough to do so, and signed over custody of Joshua to her husband, Randy, who had meanwhile moved to Winnebago County in Wisconsin and had remarried. Within 2 years, by the time Joshua was 2.5 or 3 years old, in other words, Joshua had lived a life that none of us could possibly want. Joshua lived a life that, according to figures in 2009, well over 3.3 million children live every year, lives of terrible, horrifying, tragic abuse. Joshua was first admitted in 1982 to a local emergency room brought in by his aunt, where the attending physicians found that he had injuries pretty much on every part of the lower extremity of his body, including his buttocks and his penis, indentations around his genital area, for example, which suggested strongly that he had been hit and attacked repeatedly with combs and other kinds of things. But perhaps most horrifying were the brain-related injuries. Joshua was actually removed from his father's custody for a very short period of time while county authorities did a quick investigation, and he was later remanded back to his father's custody, along with continued visits over the next 2 years. And to their credit, Winnebago County authorities did continually investigate Joshua and his family living arrangement. They went to the house at least 4 times over the next 2 years. Sadly, on 2 of those occasions, the social worker was told that she couldn't see Joshua, once because he was feeling ill, another time because he had the flu. Finally, Joshua, as you can probably predict, was admitted to the hospital 1 more time. The last time he was admitted to the hospital, he was permanently removed from his father's custody, but by then, the extent of the damage was so horrific that Joshua was remanded to a state institution where he is now and will be for the rest of his life. Over 1/2 of his brain was simply physically destroyed. He has little, if any, cognitive function to this day. Melody DeShaney, his mother, apparently was unaware of the living conditions of Joshua, but of course found out soon enough, and upon hearing it, decided to sue the state of Wisconsin. Now, she might have sued Randy DeShaney, the husband, but there are good reasons not to bother. The biggest reason, the most obvious reason not to sue Randy DeShaney is he has no money. There is little that can be accomplished by suing Randy DeShaney other than whatever moral sanction you might get out of it. If you're interested in what happened to Randy, he entered what lawyers know as an Alfred plea, which means he did not contest the charges. He was sentenced to a maximum of 4 years in jail, and he served just over 2 years of prison time. To the best of my knowledge, he hasn't been in trouble since. He did, however, win the Wisconsin State Lottery. Not for a lot of money, but the idea that he would win any money at all strikes me as profoundly unjust in ways I can't even describe. Now, here's why I wanted to talk about Joshua. And I thought about not mentioning him by name, but I thought it was important to put a face on it. Why did I think about not mentioning him by name? Because I'm afraid that much of what I have to say only uses Joshua as a prop. And if you want to say that I, too, have contributed to Joshua's abuse, I think I'm going to take the Alfred plea to that, just like Randy did. But nevertheless, here's what I want to say. When Melody sued the state of Wisconsin, she argued that it was the state of Wisconsin, at least as much as Randy DeShaney, the father, who was responsible for her child's abuse. Her argument was that the state knew Joshua was at risk from his father, and it was her further argument that the state could have and should have done more to protect Joshua from the violence that was perpetrated on him. She made essentially what lawyers would call two different kinds of arguments. And I want to explore one at some length, so I'll get rid of the other one now. The first argument she made is known to lawyers as the positive liberty argument. She argued that the state of Wisconsin had violated Joshua's right to due process of law. And apparently the argument runs something like this. The 14th Amendment says, no state shall deny to any person due process of law. And the argument here was that the state is obligated to protect those who it knows are in danger. And its failure to protect Joshua was a violation of his positive liberty claim to be protected from violence. The court had absolutely no difficulty in dismissing that argument almost out of hand. It would take us a long way to go down the road, and I haven't got the time or the inclination to do it. Trust me when I tell you that the Supreme Court has never, ever held that Americans have a positive liberty claim to anything, and it is unlikely that it will ever do so in the near future, particularly with this court. That's not really what I want to talk about. Joshua's claim failed for yet another reason, and it's one that I want to spend a little bit of time on here. It's called the state action doctrine. The argument goes back again to the very language of the 14th Amendment, and its key opening words are, no state shall. And there, according to Chief Justice Rehnquist and a majority of the court, was the biggest impediment to Joshua's lawsuit. The state hadn't harmed Joshua, the argument ran. Private actors had harmed Joshua. The private actor being his father. The state action doctrine holds that constitutional rights and liberties may only be violated by state actors. Think state in the grand sense that Richie mentioned it. Think of it in the small sense of school teachers, but it has to be a state employee. And the argument here was only Joshua's father had harmed him. The state had nothing to do with it. The state action doctrine has been described by one great scholar as, and here's why I have one of my notes, as a torchless search for a way out of a damp, echoing cave. Which is, I think, a nice way of summarizing the basic point, which is that the state action doctrine is incoherent as a matter of law, but that's not really why I want to challenge it. Think about this for a minute. We could challenge it, right? We could all say, of course the state harmed Joshua. They knew he was in danger. They actually removed him from his father's custody, and they still, in the end, did nothing. We could argue, if we wanted to, that there was state action, and a majority of the court disagreed. A minority of the court, Justice Brennan in particular, did agree. Lawyers have these arguments all the time. I have this argument in my constitutional law course all the time. Was there state action? Here's what keeps me up at night. Who the bleep cares if there was state action? I want to propose a constitutional revolution. I want to suggest now that we should junk the state action doctrine altogether. The practical effect of that would be to make the Constitution applicable not only to state actors, but to all private actors as well. And at the risk of taking cheap shots, it would mean, for example, that you have freedom of speech, not only against state governments and city governments, but about private corporations, or against private universities. It might be the case, just hypothetically speaking, that some private universities might actually have to allow chalking, not because it would be a good idea, right? Do you have a place in mind? Because I didn't. It might be, in other words, that the Constitution's real protections are irrelevant. I mean, the government doesn't interfere with my speech. Maybe it interferes with yours, but I've said a lot of nasty, outrageous things over the years, and the government has never shut me down. They've never even tried to shut me down. The government is not routinely in the business of violating my rights. Private power violates my rights. Corporations violate my rights. On a day-to-day basis, the Constitution is irrelevant because threats to us come from private parties, just like threats to Joshua came from a private party that the state authorized to act. The most important way to make the Constitution genuinely relevant, to making it matter, is to make it apply to private action as well as to state action. Thank you.
Many parts of the United States Constitution deal with rights of an individual, and many amendments talk about protecting or expanding the rights of an individual. But the 14th Amendment is perhaps one of the most important amendments in this discussion of protecting civil rights. And in particular, Section 1 is the part that is most cited. So let's just read this together. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So let's just focus in on parts of it. So one big takeaway about the 14th Amendment, this is the federal government saying, hey, these are things that the state cannot do. So for example, when it says, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, this is a restatement of the Fifth Amendment that, hey, people can't just stick you in jail or take away your property without you going through some type of a process, a legal process. Well, in the Fifth Amendment, this was really talking about the federal government not being able to just take your property or your liberty away from you without the process of law. But here it's saying, nor shall any state. And this clause right over here, this is known as the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Then right after that it says, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The equal protection of the laws. I'm going to underline that. And this, you might guess, is called the Equal Protection Clause. Now, the context in which the 14th Amendment was ratified, it happens in 1868, shortly after the end of the Civil War. You, of course, have the 13th Amendment that, among other things, abolishes slavery. But then you have these things in the South called black codes, which continued to repress the rights of African Americans. And that's why Congress felt the need for the 14th Amendment to be passed. Now, one of the most notable cases in which the 14th Amendment was brought up happens in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. And we have a whole video about this. And this is a case in which it was argued that it was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment for African Americans to have to travel in a separate train car from white Americans. And the Supreme Court infamously said that, hey, as long as it is equal, it is okay for it to be separate, and that would not violate the 14th Amendment. And so this idea of separate but equal comes about. Now, that was significantly challenged as we go into 1954, where you have Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Board of Education. And here, the argument was that inherently separate could not be equal. And once again, the 14th Amendment was invoked. And this time, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that yes, separate can't be equal, and that the schools needed to be desegregated. So even though it wasn't an official overruling of Plessy versus Ferguson, it was a functional overruling of this doctrine of separate but equal. And as we go into the 1960s civil rights movement, led by folks like Martin Luther King, there's a 14th Amendment that was cited often. In another video, we're going to look at Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, in which he articulates the ideas of the civil rights movement. It's a quite moving letter. But once again, it's evoking these ideas of the 14th Amendment. And it goes on to movements as disparate as the women's rights movement, led by organizations like the National Organization for Women, citing equal protection of the laws in situations of sexual discrimination in the workplace. You have pro-life groups citing the 14th Amendment, arguing that an unborn fetus's right to life is protected by the 14th Amendment. You have rulings around whether quotas in higher education are legal or not, once again, citing ideas of equal protection of the laws. So as you go forth in your study of United States government, the 14th Amendment, especially Section 1, is going to keep showing up.